a first-class cabin, a world of champagne, warm towels, and whispered privilege. For Robert and Catherine Beaumont, it was their natural habitat. But on a routine flight from New York to London, their exclusive sanctuary became a public stage for their own undoing. They saw a young black woman, serene and unassuming, settled in a seat they felt she hadn't earned, and they made a demand. A demand that would not only expose their prejudice, but would shatter the very foundation of their carefully constructed lives. They told her to leave. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly fathom, was that they were demanding the removal of the one person who held all of their lives in her hands. Stay with me as we uncover how their world came crashing down at 38,000 feet. The air in the Polaris Lounge at Newark Liberty International was a carefully curated blend of brewed coffee, expensive perfume, and the low, self-important hum of global business. It was a symphony of status, and Robert Beaumont conducted it with the unconscious ease of a man who believed he was born to the role. He was tall, dressed in a tailored Xenia suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, with a salt and pepper coif that looked expensively managed. At his side, his wife Catherine was a vision in cream-colored cashmere and discreet Tiffany diamonds. She scanned the room not for a seat, but for an audience, her gaze a finely tuned instrument for assessing and dismissing everyone around her. They were by all accounts the picture of success. Robert was a senior partner at a prestigious private equity firm, Sterling Thorne Capital. He was flying to London to close the deal of a lifetime, a multi-billion-dollar acquisition of a British tech firm. This deal wasn't just about money. It was his magnum opus, the move that would cement his legacy and catapult him into the stratosphere of New York finance. "I still can't believe they seated us next to the galley," Catherine murmured, dabbing her lips with a napkin after a sip of complimentary Veuve Clicquot. "For what we paid, you'd think we'd have a bit more tranquility." Robert gave a placating smile, though his eyes were already on his tablet, scrolling through market data. "It's just for a few more minutes, darling. Once we're on the plane, it's Pod 2A and 2B, as far from the noise as one can get." Their boarding group was called, and they moved with the unhurried grace of people who have never had to rush for anything. They bypassed the sprawling line of economy passengers, their expressions a mixture of pity and annoyance at the common herd. They were the first to walk down the jet bridge for Flight 90, a Boeing 787 Dreamliner destined for Heathrow. As they stepped into the quiet, hushed cabin of first class, they were greeted by Sarah, a senior flight attendant, with a warm, professional smile that had been perfected over 20 years of service. "Welcome aboard, Mr. and Mrs. Beaumont." Robert gave a curt nod, already moving toward his seat, while Catherine offered a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. They settled their things, Catherine carefully placing her Hermes Birkin bag in the overhead compartment with a reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. It was then that they saw her. In Pod 1A, the most coveted seat in the cabin directly in front of them, sat a young black woman. She couldn't have been more than 30. She was wearing a simple, well-fitting black turtleneck, comfortable-looking trousers, and a pair of elegant but practical-looking loafers. Her hair was styled in intricate shoulder-length braids. She wasn't on her phone or watching a movie. She was deeply engrossed in a thick, leather-bound book, its pages filled with complex diagrams and equations. An open laptop on the tray table beside her displayed what looked like a flight simulation program. She seemed completely at ease, a picture of calm focus amidst the subtle bustle of boarding. Catherine froze midway through arranging her cashmere wrap. She shot a sharp, incredulous look at Robert. Robert, following her gaze, felt a flicker of irritation. his mind conditioned to see patterns and categorize everything struggled to place this woman. She didn't fit the profile of the usual first-class passenger, the aging CEOs, the Russian oligarchs, the trust fund heirs. Her youth and her race, combined with her serene confidence, created a dissonance in his ordered world. "Robert," Catherine whispered, her voice tight with disapproval. "What is that?" It wasn't a question about the book or the laptop. The emphasis on the word "that" was laden with 1,000 unspoken assumptions. Robert frowned, his jaw tightening. He watched as a flight attendant approached the young woman, offering her a pre-departure drink. "Dr. Reed," the attendant said, with genuine warmth and respect. "Champagne orange juice or water for you this evening." The woman, Dr. Reed, looked up from her book, her eyes bright and intelligent. She gave a warm smile that transformed her focused expression into one of approachable grace. "Just water for me tonight. Thank you, Michael." "Of course," he replied before moving on. The title Doctor did little to assuage the Beaumonts' indignation. If anything, it deepened their suspicion. Doctor of what Robert thought dismissively. Probably some liberal arts degree from a second-rate college, a beneficiary of some diversity program. Catherine leaned closer to Robert, her voice a venomous hiss. "She must be an airline employee on a discounted ticket. They're supposed to be in the back. Or worse, she's used someone else's frequent flyer miles. There has been a mistake. You need to fix this, Robert." For Catherine, appearances were everything. The integrity of the first-class cabin was a direct reflection of her own status. To share it with someone she deemed unworthy was to have her own worth diminished. For Robert, it was a matter of principle. He had paid a small fortune for these tickets, for this exclusivity. He saw the woman's presence as a breach of contract, a dilution of the very product he had purchased. He caught the eye of Sarah, the senior flight attendant, and beckoned her over with an imperious flick of his fingers. He had a problem, and he expected it to be solved immediately. The symphony of the cabin was about to hit a very sour note. Sarah approached with her practiced, unflappable smile, though a sixth sense, honed by decades of handling difficult passengers, warned her that this was not going to be a simple request for an extra pillow. "Mr. Beaumont, is everything all right?" she asked, her tone perfectly modulated. Robert didn't bother to lower his voice. He gestured with a dismissive wave of his hand towards seat 1A. "We seem to have a situation here. My wife and I are just a bit concerned about the seating arrangements." Sarah's eyes flickered briefly to the woman in 1A, Dr. Reed, who seemed oblivious, still engrossed in her book, though the slight tensing of her shoulders suggested she was more aware than she let on. "Is there an issue with your seat, sir? I can assure you pods 2A and 2B are identical to—" Catherine cut her off, her voice laced with a saccharine condescension that was far more insulting than outright anger. "Oh, our seats are fine, dear. It's more about the clientele. We've paid a significant amount of money for this experience, and we were under the impression that there were certain standards." The implication hung in the air, thick and ugly. Sarah's professional smile tightened by a millimeter. She knew exactly what was happening. She had seen this play out a dozen times before, in a dozen different ways. "I can assure you, madam, that every passenger in this cabin has a valid ticket for their assigned seat," Sarah said, her voice remaining level and polite. Robert scoffed, leaning forward as if sharing a conspiratorial secret. "Look, we understand how it works. Upgrades employee travel points. But surely there's a protocol. Someone like that," he said, again, with a pointed look at the young woman, "is clearly out of her element. It's disruptive. It lowers the tone of the cabin." Dr. Reed slowly placed a thin, elegant bookmark between the pages of her book and closed it. She didn't turn around. She simply sat there, her posture perfect, her presence a silent rebuttal to their venom. The act of closing the book was subtle, but it was a clear signal she was now listening. The entire front section of the cabin, which had been a cocoon of private worlds, was now silent. The other passengers shamelessly eavesdropping. Sarah felt a flush of anger on behalf of the young woman, but her training kicked in. De-escalate, reassure, maintain control. Sir, our passenger in 1A is a confirmed and ticketed first-class traveler. I'm afraid there's no mistake, she stated firmly. Then check again. Catherine snapped, her patience wearing thin. Perhaps she's on a watch list. She just seems suspicious. All that equipment, she said, gesturing to the laptop. What is all that for? The absurdity of the accusation was staggering. Robert, sensing his wife was going too far, decided to take a different, more reasonable tack. Let's be pragmatic, he said to Sarah, lowering his voice slightly as if he were negotiating a business deal. We are premier million-mile flyers with this airline. We have significant corporate accounts. We are loyal customers. He said the word dripping with disdain, is not. Now I'm sure there's an empty seat in business class or even premium economy that would be more suitable for her. We'd be doing you a favor avoiding a scene. It was the threat veiled as a suggestion that finally made Dr. Reed turn her head. She looked not at the Beaumonts, but directly at Sarah. Her expression was not one of anger or hurt, but of a kind of weary disappointment. She gave Sarah a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if giving her permission to handle it as she saw fit. Sarah took a deep breath. Mr. Beaumont, I will not be asking another passenger to move from her rightful seat based on your personal feelings. Dr. Reed is exactly where she is supposed to be. The use of the title doctor again seemed to enrage Catherine. Doctor, of what sociology is she writing a paper on us? This is an invasion of our privacy. I want to speak to your supervisor. I want to speak to the captain. This is unacceptable. The scene was escalating. Other passengers were now openly staring. A man in seat 3D, a Japanese gentleman in a pristine suit, looked on with an expression of profound disapproval. A young couple across the aisle looked deeply uncomfortable. Robert stood up, his height an attempt to intimidate. Ma'am, this isn't a request anymore. This is a matter of comfort and security. Either you move her, or you'll have a formal complaint filed against you and this airline that will be read by your CEO personally by the time we land. I am Robert Beaumont of Sterling Thorn Capital. Look me up. He had played his trump card. The name, the firm, the implied power. In his world, it was a conversational checkmate. It always worked. Sarah stood her ground, her face pale but resolute. I understand, Mr. Beaumont. Please allow me a moment. I will go and get the purser, my direct supervisor. You do that, Robert said, sitting back down with a smug look. He turned to Catherine and patted her hand. It's being handled, darling. They both sat back, radiating an aura of victory. They had flexed their power and were confident the system would bend to their will, as it always did. They fully expected a flustered supervisor to appear, offer 1,000 apologies, and sheepishly ask the young woman to gather her things. Dr. Reed, meanwhile, had turned back to face the front of the plane. She picked up a laminated checklist from the seat pocket and began to read it, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the toxic atmosphere the Beaumonts had created. To them, her composure was the ultimate insult, the quiet, unassailable confidence of someone who knew something they didn't, and they were about to find out exactly what that was. Sarah did not return with the purser. Instead, she walked briskly toward the front galley, her face a mask of controlled professionalism, and picked up the intercabin phone. Her conversation was brief and quiet, her words inaudible to the passengers. When she hung up, she returned not to the Beaumonts, but to Dr. Reed. She leaned down and spoke in a low voice meant only for the woman in 1A. "I am so sorry you are being subjected to this, doctor." Dr. Reed looked up, her eyes showing not a hint of distress. "It's not your fault, Sarah. You're handling it by the book. Don't worry." Her voice was calm and melodic, a soothing balm against the Beaumonts' harsh tones. She then glanced at her watch, a practical but clearly high-end aviation timepiece. "But boarding is nearly complete. We're on a tight schedule with the transatlantic slot." Sarah nodded, a look of understanding passing between them. "I know. The gate agent is on their way with the final manifest. I've informed them of the situation." This quiet, respectful exchange only further fueled the Beaumonts' fury. It was as if they were being deliberately excluded from a conversation about them. "What is going on?" Robert demanded, his voice once again booming through the cabin. "Where is your supervisor?" Before Sarah could reply, a man in a crisp airline uniform appeared at the cabin door. It was David, the lead gate agent. He held a tablet with the flight's final information. "Is there a problem here, Sarah?" he asked, his eyes scanning the tense tableau. Robert immediately took charge. "Yes, there is. This woman," he said, foregoing any pretense of subtlety and pointing directly at Dr. Reed, "is refusing to move from a seat she clearly doesn't belong in. We are first-class passengers being harassed, and your flight attendant is refusing to do anything about it." David looked from Robert's apoplectic face to Catherine's pinched expression of outrage, and then to Dr. Reed, who simply met his gaze with a calm, waiting stillness. David recognized her instantly, and a look of dawning horror crossed his face as he realized what was happening. He turned back to Robert, his expression now serious, almost grave. "Sir, I can personally vouch for the fact that every passenger on this aircraft is in their correct assigned seat, especially the passengers in 1A. This public refutation coming from a figure of authority was a direct hit to Robert's ego. He was being contradicted, told he was wrong. In his world, that did not happen. "Are you telling me," Robert said, his voice dangerously low, "that you are going to prioritize her over a premier executive client? Do you have any idea of the consequences of that decision?" Catherine, sensing a shift in power, tried a different tactic, feigning distress. "I feel threatened," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Her attitude, it's so aggressive. We don't feel safe." The accusation was so patently false, so transparently manipulative, that a short, sharp laugh escaped from the man in 3D. He immediately covered his mouth, but the damage was done. The Beaumonts' credibility was dissolving. David, the gate agent, looked utterly exasperated. "Mirren Mrs. Beaumont, if you are feeling unsafe, I can offer to rebook you on the next flight to London, which departs in 7 hours. The offer was a slap in the face. "Rebook them." The idea was inconceivable. "You will do no such thing," Robert thundered, finally losing the last vestiges of his composure. "We are not the problem here. She is— Get the captain. I demand to speak with the pilot right now. Let's see what someone with real authority has to say about this." It was the ultimate escalation. In the rigid hierarchy of air travel, the captain's word was law. The Beaumonts were certain that a seasoned, no-nonsense pilot, whom they invariably pictured as a tall, authoritative white man in his 50s, would see the situation for what it was, recognize them as the true high-value assets, and restore order to his aircraft. "You want to speak to the captain?" David asked, a strange, unreadable expression on his face. It wasn't anger or frustration. It was something closer to anticipation. "Yes." "Now," Robert commanded. "Very well," David said. He nodded to Sarah. "I think it's time." Sarah nodded back, a faint, knowing smile finally gracing her lips. She turned and walked a few steps to the cockpit door. The cabin fell into a deep, expectant hush. The Beaumonts leaned forward in their seats, their faces flushed with the thrill of impending victory. They had pushed the issue to the highest authority, and they had no doubt what the outcome would be. Sarah knocked twice on the cockpit door. "First Officer Jensen, it's time." The door swung inward. But it wasn't a grizzled male captain who emerged. It was a clean-cut man in his late 30s with a co-pilot's uniform. This was First Officer Mark Jensen. He looked out at the cabin, his eyes landing on the Beaumonts, then on David, and then on Sarah. He simply nodded. The Beaumonts looked confused. "Where's the captain?" Catherine asked. Sarah smiled. "He's right here." And then the moment that would forever be seared into the Beaumonts' memory unfolded. From Seat 1A, Dr. Evelyn Reed placed her book and checklist neatly on her seat. She stood up, her movements fluid and economical. She was taller than they had realized, her posture exuding an aura of calm, unshakable authority. She turned to face the cabin, her gaze sweeping over the gawking passengers, before settling with piercing intensity on Robert and Catherine Beaumont. She gave them a cool, appraising look, the kind a scientist might give a specimen under a microscope. Then she turned to her crew. "Sarah, David, Mark," she said, her voice clear and commanding, filling the silent cabin. "Is the cabin secure for departure?" "Yes, Captain," they replied in near unison. Evelyn Reed then looked directly at the stunned gate agent. "David, you can close the jet to bridge. We're on schedule." She gave a brief professional nod to her first officer. "Mark, let's run the pre-flight checklist one more time." With that, she turned her back on the Beaumonts, and the rest of the passengers took the 3 steps to the cockpit and disappeared inside, shutting the door firmly behind her. For a full 10 seconds, the only sound in the first-class cabin was the faint ambient hum of the aircraft's auxiliary power unit. It was a silence so profound, so absolute, that it was louder than any shouting match could ever have been. Robert and Catherine Beaumont were frozen in their seats. Their faces, which had been masks of smug certainty just moments before, had collapsed into a grotesque tableau of disbelief, confusion, and dawning horror. Catherine's mouth was slightly agape, her perfectly applied lipstick suddenly looking garish. Robert's face had gone from a florid red to a pasty, sickly white. The name he had wielded like a weapon, Robert Beaumont of Sterling Thorn Capital, now seemed to hang in the air like a pathetic, deflated balloon. The other passengers were trying and failing to hide their reactions. The Japanese man in 3D, Mr. Hayes, was now looking directly at Robert, not with malice, but with a quiet, clinical assessment that was somehow far more damning. The young couple across the aisle were staring at their own laps, shoulders shaking with suppressed laughter. Sarah, the flight attendant, moved through the cabin with renewed purpose. Her professionalism was intact, but there was a new steel in her spine. She paused at the Beaumont's row. "Miss Beaumont." "Mrs. Beaumont," she asked, her voice perfectly neutral, yet every syllable was a twisting knife of their own making. "Can I get you anything before we prepare for takeoff? Champagne, perhaps? Or some water?" The offer of simple hospitality was in that moment the most exquisite form of humiliation. Catherine flinched as if she'd been struck. Robert couldn't form words. He just shook his head, a tiny, jerky movement. The jet bridge audibly disconnected from the aircraft with a solid final thud. The cabin doors were sealed. They were now trapped in their gilded cage at the mercy of the very woman they had tried to eject. A few minutes later, the cabin speakers crackled to life. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome aboard United Flight 90 with non-stop service to London Heathrow." The voice was unmistakable. It was the same calm, melodic, and now utterly authoritative voice of the woman from seat 1A. "This is your captain, Dr. Evelyn Reed, speaking. I'm joined in the cockpit by my first officer, Mark Jensen, and we have a fantastic cabin crew led by Sarah to take care of you on our journey this evening. Our flight time will be approximately 6 hours and 45 minutes. We're just waiting for final clearance from ground control, and we should be pushing back from the gate in the next 5 minutes. The weather in London is currently clear, with a temperature of 12 degrees Celsius. For now, please sit back, relax, and we'll have you on your way shortly. Thank you for flying with us." Her delivery was flawless, professional, reassuring, and completely devoid of any emotion regarding the incident that had just transpired. That more than anything was what broke Robert's stupor. Her utter professionalism was a mirror reflecting his own boorish, unprofessional behavior. She hadn't needed to raise her voice to defend herself or to insult them. She had simply let them build their own pyre, and then she had lit the match by doing her job. Robert risked a glance across the aisle at the man in 3D, Mr. Hayes. He now recognized him. He was Kenji Hayes, the notoriously private and brilliant CEO of Innovate Dynamics, the very company in the UK that Sterling Thorne Capital was trying to acquire. Robert had been flying to London for the final face-to-face meeting to sign the papers. A meeting that was supposed to take place in 2 days. A meeting that was the culmination of 18 months of brutal, painstaking work. A cold, heavy dread, like a block of ice, began to form in the pit of Robert's stomach. Mr. Hayes had seen everything. He had heard every word. He had watched Robert Beaumont, the man who wanted to buy his company, reveal himself not as a titan of industry, but as a petty, prejudiced bully. Mr. Hayes met Robert's gaze. There was no anger in his eyes. There was only a calm, final judgment. He gave a slow, deliberate shake of his head, then turned his attention to the window, dismissing Robert as if he were nothing more than a mildly unpleasant piece of trivia. The plane began to push back from the gate. The engine spooled up with a deep, powerful whine. For every other passenger, it was the comforting sound of a journey beginning. For Robert and Catherine Beaumont, it was the sound of their world starting to crumble, a 6-hour and 45-minute flight to their own personal judgment day, piloted by the woman they had tried so desperately to cast out. The ascent of the Boeing 787 was smooth and powerful. Captain Reed's hands, which Robert had subconsciously dismissed as belonging to someone who wrote academic papers, were now expertly guiding a 250,000-ton machine into the stratosphere. Every gentle bank, every seamless adjustment to the climb was a testament to a skill and authority he had refused to see. Once the plane reached its cruising altitude of 38,000 feet, the seatbelt sign pinged off. The cabin crew began their service with practiced efficiency. The clinking of glasses, the murmur of quiet conversations, the scent of the first-course dinner being prepared. It all resumed a veneer of normalcy, stretched taut over the raw wound of the earlier confrontation. But for the Beaumonts, there was no normalcy. They were pariahs in a plush prison. Every flight attendant who approached their pod did so with a chilly, correct politeness that was more isolating than open hostility. Catherine refused to eat or drink, sitting ramrod straight, her face a mask of shame and fury. She had pulled her cashmere wrap up to her chin, as if it could shield her from the judging eyes she felt were everywhere. Robert, however, knew he had to do something. This wasn't just about social embarrassment. It was about the Innovate Dynamics deal. His career, his reputation, his entire future depended on it. He thought that perhaps he could salvage the situation, that a grand gesture of apology might mitigate the damage. He was a master negotiator after all. He could fix this. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood intending to walk over to Mr. Hayes's seat. He would apologize profusely. He would claim it was a misunderstanding, a moment of stress. He would charm him man to man. But as he took a step into the aisle, Sarah was there to block his path, seemingly out of nowhere. "Can I help you, Mr. Beaumont?" she asked, her smile not reaching her eyes. I need to have a word with Mr. Hayes," Robert stammered. "I'm afraid Mr. Hayes has requested not to be disturbed for the remainder of the flight," Sarah said, her voice firm. "He has his privacy screen raised. I must ask you to return to your seat." Checkmate. Robert looked over and saw that the electronic privacy divider for Pod 3D was indeed raised, creating an impenetrable wall. Mr. Hayes had excommunicated him. Defeated, Robert sank back into his seat. The first tendrils of real panic began to curl around his heart. He spent the next hour composing an email on his laptop to Kenji Hayes. He wrote and rewrote it a dozen times, trying to strike the perfect tone of contrition and professionalism. He explained that his behavior was inexcusable, a result of travel fatigue and a deep-seated irrational fear of flying that sometimes manifested as aggression, a blatant lie but the best he could come up with. He praised Mr. Hayes's company and reiterated his profound respect for its innovative spirit. He pressed send the whoosh of the email, leaving his outbox, sounding like a desperate prayer. For the next 2 hours, he obsessively refreshed his inbox, waiting for a reply that never came. Meanwhile, a quiet drama was unfolding in the rest of the cabin. A well-known journalist from the Wall Street Journal, seated in 4A, was discreetly typing notes into his phone. He had recognized both Robert Beaumont and Kenji Hayes, and he understood the monumental significance of what he had just witnessed. This wasn't just a cabin drama. It was a business story, a human interest story, and a cultural lightning rod all in one. Catherine finally broke her silence, her whisper a ragged, desperate sound. "What are we going to do?" "Robert." Everyone saw. Everyone heard. "That man. Who was he?" "He's Kenji Hayes." Robert admitted the name, tasting like ash in his mouth. "He's the CEO. It was his company." Catherine's eyes widened in horror. Her distress was not for their behavior, but for the consequences. "The deal. The one you've been working on for 2 years. "Yes," Robert said, his voice hollow. Their personal prejudice had collided with their professional ambitions in the most catastrophic way imaginable. They hadn't just insulted a random passenger. They had publicly humiliated themselves in front of the one man on Earth they needed to impress. Half an hour before landing, the speakers crackled again. "Good morning from the flight deck," Captain Reed's voice announced, as crisp and clear as the London morning they were flying into. "We're beginning our initial descent into London Heathrow. We should be on the ground in about 25 minutes, a full 15 minutes ahead of schedule. Cabin crew, please prepare the cabin for landing." Ahead of schedule. Of course she was. Efficient, professional, perfect. Each word was another small twist of the knife. As the plane descended through the clouds, Robert looked out the window at the sprawling lights of London. A city of opportunity that now felt like a city of judgment. His phone, which he'd switched on in anticipation of landing, buzzed. It was an email, not from Kenji Hayes, but from his own CEO at Sterling Thorne Capital Franklin. Sterling himself. The timestamp showed it had been sent just 5 minutes ago. The subject line was a single ominous word, urgent. Robert's hands trembled as he opened it. The message was short and brutal. Robert and I just got off the phone with Kenji Hayes of Innovate Dynamics. He has formally pulled out of the acquisition deal, citing a catastrophic values misalignment with our firm's senior leadership. He also forwarded me a detailed account of your conduct on Flight 90 from a WSJ reporter who was also on board. Do not proceed to the hotel. Do not attempt to contact anyone at Innovate Dynamics. You will be met at the gate by our London office head, who will collect all company property. Your employment with Sterling Thorne Capital is terminated effective immediately. Consider this your final communication. Do not contact me. Franklin. Robert read the email 3 times, but the words didn't change. Terminated. Effective immediately. His magnum opus wasn't just dead. It had reached back from the grave and strangled his entire career. He dropped the phone into his lap as if it were on fire. "What is it?" Catherine whispered, seeing the blood drain from his face. Robert couldn't speak. He could only stare blankly ahead as the plane's landing gear deployed with a heavy final thud. It was the sound of his old life hitting the ground. The landing at Heathrow was like the rest of the flight, impeccably smooth. Captain Evelyn Reed brought the massive Dreamliner to the tarmac with a grace that belied the machine's complexity. As the plane taxied to the gate, the usual flurry of activity began. Phones were switched on, bags were gathered, and people began to stand. But the Beaumonts remained seated, paralyzed by the implosion of their lives. When the seatbelt sign switched off, the other first-class passengers began to deplane. Mr. Hayes was the first to leave, met at the door by a waiting assistant. He didn't even glance in Robert's direction. It was the ultimate power move to not even acknowledge the existence of the man who had tried to ruin his evening. One by one, the other passengers filed past their faces, a mixture of pity, contempt, and simple relief to be away from the toxicity. The Beaumonts were left nearly alone in the cabin, the crew discreetly tidying up around them, giving them a wide berth. Finally, they had no choice but to stand and gather their things. As Robert pulled his briefcase from the overhead bin, his hands felt clumsy and weak. The leather, which had always felt like a symbol of his power, now just felt like dead weight. As they walked toward the exit, they came face to face with the cockpit door, which was now open. First Officer Mark Jensen was there completing paperwork. He looked up, and his expression was cold, professional, and utterly dismissive. And standing just behind him, visible inside the cockpit as she ran through her post-flight shutdown sequence, was Captain Reed. She didn't look at them. She was focused on her work, her profile illuminated by the glow of the dozens of complex instruments and screens that she commanded with such effortless expertise. She was in her world, a world of physics engineering and immense responsibility, a world so far beyond their petty prejudices that they might as well have been a different species. The power they thought they had derived from money and status was a flickering candle next to the sun of her competence. They stepped onto the jet bridge, and the final act of Robert's career played out exactly as the email had foretold. A grim-faced man in a suit, Jonathan Pierce, the head of the London office, was waiting for him. "Robert," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth. He didn't offer a handshake. "I need the company laptop phone and your corporate cards." Wordlessly, Robert handed them over. The transfer of these items, the totems of his professional life, felt like a surrender. "There's a car waiting to take you to a hotel near the airport," Jonathan said. "The firm has paid for 1 night. After that, you're on your own. A severance package, if any, will be determined by legal and mailed to your home address." He then looked at Catherine with a flicker of pity before his expression hardened again. "I'm sorry," he said, though it was clear he wasn't. He turned and walked away without another word. Catherine finally broke, a choked twawl escaping her lips. "Robert, what have you done?" she cried, her accusation hanging in the sterile air of the jet bridge. But the worst was yet to come. As they walked into the arrivals hall, a flash went off. Then another. The Wall Street Journal reporter had evidently wasted no time. His story, likely filed mid-flight via the plane's Wi-Fi, had already broken. A small scrum of British reporters, alerted to their arrival, was waiting. "Mr. Beaumont, is it true Sterling Thorne fired you over a racist incident on the flight? Mrs. Beaumont, what do you have to say to accusations of harassment? Is it true you tried to have the captain of your own flight removed?" They were cornered, the questions like blows, the camera flashes like explosions. They shoved their way through the crowd, their faces a picture of public disgrace. The first-class experience, which was meant to insulate them from the world, had delivered them directly into a nightmare of their own creation. They had paid thousands for a ticket that brought them nothing but ruin. Several hours later, in a quiet pub near Heathrow, a different scene was unfolding. The flight crew of Flight 90 was gathered for a post-trip drink, a long-standing tradition. The mood was one of relief and quiet celebration. Sarah raised her glass of gin and tonic. "To the calmest captain in the fleet. Evelyn, I have never seen anyone handle a situation with that much grace and steel. You were brilliant." Evelyn Reed, now dressed in a simple pair of jeans and a sweater, smiled. "You were the one on the front lines, Sarah. You handled them perfectly." "I was terrified," Sarah admitted. "When he dropped the name of his firm, I thought for sure I was going to be written up." "Never," Evelyn said firmly. "I would have backed you 100%, all the way to the top. What they did was unacceptable. We have a zero-tolerance policy for harassment of passengers or crew, and believe me, they will be receiving a lifetime ban from this airline." First Officer Mark Jensen shook his head in lingering disbelief. The sheer arrogance, to demand the captain, and not even consider that the captain could be you. Evelyn took a sip of her water. "It's not the first time I've dealt with that kind of assumption. When I was at the Air Force Academy, they told me I'd never make it as a fighter pilot. When I got my PhD in aeronautical engineering from MIT, a professor suggested I'd be better suited to a management track. When I became the youngest woman to test pilot a new generation of Boeing aircraft, I had executives who refused to look me in the eye. The Beaumonts, they weren't original. They were just louder than most." She looked out the window at the sky, a canvas of deepening twilight. "My mentor, a Tuskegee airman I met when I was just a girl, told me something I never forgot. He said, 'Don't ever let their ignorance dim your altitude. Let your excellence be your response. Fly so high that their smallness becomes invisible.'" She paused, then looked back at her crew. "What they did tonight wasn't about me. It was about them, about their fear and their insecurity. All I had to do was fly the plane." And that was the ultimate truth. While the Beaumonts' world was a smouldering ruin brought down by their own hatred, Evelyn Reed's world was as vast and limitless as the sky she commanded. Her identity wasn't defined by a first-class seat, a designer bag, or a corporate title. It was defined by her skill, her intellect, and her character. The news cycle would churn for a few days. Robert Beaumont would become a temporary symbol of corporate hubris and prejudice. Sterling Thorne Capital would issue a public apology and announce a mandatory new diversity and inclusion program. The story would become a viral tale of karma. But for Captain Dr. Evelyn Reed, it was just another Tuesday. Tomorrow, she will be back in the cockpit of another marvel of engineering, ready to chart a course across oceans and continents. She didn't need their validation. She had her wings, and as she looked out at the horizon, she knew, as she always had, that her journey was just beginning. 6 months after the fateful flight, the story of what happened on Flight 90 had moved from the ephemeral churn of the 24-hour news cycle into the realm of viral legend. It became a kind of modern-day fable, shared in boardrooms and breakrooms alike, as a cautionary tale about arrogance and the quiet, unassailable power of competence. But for the story's central figures, the consequences were not a fable. They were the stark, unyielding reality of their daily lives. For Robert and Catherine Beaumont, the descent had been swift and brutal. They had returned to New York not as a power couple, but as disgraced pariahs. The Wall Street Journal article written by the journalist in Seat 4A was a masterclass in factual, dispassionate reporting that in its very lack of sensationalism painted them as petty, prejudiced fools. It was titled simply, "Turbulence in First Class." How a Sterling Thorne partner's hubris grounded a multi-billion-dollar deal. Robert's professional life was annihilated. In the tight-knit, reputation-obsessed world of high finance, he was radioactive. No firm would touch him. The name he had once wielded as a key to any door was now a permanent stain. He had gone from orchestrating billion-dollar acquisitions to spending his days in the sterile silence of their cavernous Park Avenue apartment, which was now on the market for a fraction of its worth. The legal battles with Sterling Thorne over his severance had drained their liquid assets, and the creditors were beginning to circle. But the financial ruin was in some ways secondary to the social death. Catherine, whose entire identity had been woven from the threads of social connections, charity boards, and exclusive galas, found herself utterly alone. Her friends stopped returning her calls. A coldly polite email informed her that the board of the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Benefit Committee felt her continued presence would be a distraction. She was no longer welcome in the world she had so meticulously curated. Their shared prison bred only resentment. The quiet affection they once had, or at least pretended to have had, curdled into a thick, poisonous animosity. If you hadn't been so loud, so theatrical, Robert would hiss at her over their silent dinners of takeout food, eaten from cardboard containers. If you had just let it go, none of this would have happened. Me? Catherine would retort, her voice brittle with unshed tears. You were the one who stood up and puffed out your chest. You were the one who demanded to see the captain. You were the one who had to play the big man, Robert. And look where it got us. That woman. She didn't ruin us. You did. They hadn't learned a thing about their prejudice. Their anger was not directed at their own flawed character, but at the world that had dared to punish them for it. They saw Evelyn Reed not as a person they had wronged, but as a cruel instrument of fate. In their minds, they were the victims. Their fall from grace had taught them nothing of humility, only the bitter taste of consequence. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Captain Dr. Evelyn Reed was navigating a different, entirely unexpected trajectory. The media firestorm had been for her deeply uncomfortable. She was a private person, a pilot and an engineer who found solace in the precise logical world of aerodynamics and flight systems, not in the chaotic glare of the public eye. She had politely declined dozens of interview requests from major news networks to daytime talk shows, issuing only a single brief statement through the airline. "I am proud of my crew and our professionalism. We are committed to ensuring a safe and respectful environment for all our passengers." She thought and hoped that would be the end of it. But it wasn't. The story had taken on a life of its own. She became a symbol. For women in STEM, for black professionals. For anyone who had ever felt underestimated or marginalized, her quiet, dignified victory was their own. The turning point came not from a TV producer, but in the form of a handwritten letter forwarded to her by the airline's headquarters. It was from a 14-year-old girl in Chicago named Amara. "Dear Captain Reed." The letter began in neat, careful cursive. "My name is Amara, and I read about you online. I want to be an aerospace engineer, but my guidance counselor told me I should think about something more realistic. My mom showed me your picture and told me you have a PhD from MIT and that you test-piloted new airplanes before you became a captain. She said, 'You are what happens when you don't listen to people who tell you what you can't do.' Seeing you in your uniform in front of all those controls made me feel like I wasn't crazy for dreaming so big. Thank you for flying your plane. You showed me that my own sky has no ceiling." Evelyn read the letter several times, a profound sense of purpose settling over her. She thought of her Tuskegee Airman mentor and his words about altitude. She realized her altitude was no longer just about how high she could fly a plane. It was about how many others she could lift up with her. She finally accepted one invitation. It wasn't to a news studio, but to be the keynote speaker at the annual Conference for Women in Aviation International. Standing on stage in her crisp captain's uniform, she looked out at a sea of faces. Veteran pilots, young cadets, and teenage girls like Amara. And she told her story. Not the story of the Beaumonts, whom she never mentioned by name, but the story of her journey of the challenges, the biases, and the unshakable passion that drove her forward. Her speech went viral. Corporations looking to align themselves with her message of grace and excellence, and perhaps to inoculate themselves from their own Beaumont-like scandals, began to reach out. An aeronautics giant offered to fund a scholarship in her name, the Dr. Evelyn Reed Altitude Award, for aspiring minority women in STEM. A publisher offered her a book deal, not just for a memoir, but for a series of young adult books aimed at inspiring the next generation of scientists and pilots. Evelyn, with the help of a savvy pro bono legal team, established a foundation. She didn't have to fly every week anymore. She flew when she wanted to keep her skills sharp, but her new flight path was on the ground, visiting schools, mentoring students, and using her unexpected platform to build a more inclusive future in the fields she loved. The Beaumonts' world had shrunk to the four walls of an apartment they could no longer afford. Their horizon was a dead end. Captain Reed's world, which had always been as wide as the sky, had expanded even further. She had become a captain in more than just name guiding, not just an aircraft, but a generation of dreamers toward a horizon of their own. Dr. Evelyn Reed's story is a powerful, real-life reminder that a person's worth is not determined by the prejudice of others, but by their own character and competence. The Beaumonts thought their money and status put them at the top of the world, but they were brought down by the one thing they couldn't buy: respect. They looked at a brilliant, accomplished woman and saw only what their own bigotry allowed them to see. And in the end, it cost them everything. Evelyn Reed never had to stoop to their level. As her mentor said, she simply let her excellence be her response. This story shows that sometimes karma isn't a mystical force. It's the natural, direct consequence of your own actions meeting a world that is thankfully starting to have less and less patience for hate. What did you think of the Beaumonts' epic downfall? Let me know in the comments below. If you believe karma was served ice-cold at 38,000 feet, do me a favor and hit that like button. Share this video so others can hear this incredible story of justice, and make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss another tale of real-life drama and unexpected twists. Thanks for listening.